Okay. It's very interesting because you say that a lot of things that we can do now, the space, the democratic space that we have, it's partly due to the development of technology, but sometimes regulators catch up with us. So like we know that the anti-fake news law has been tabled. That I think that I'm not so sure, but looking at what has been tabled, it's going to make whistleblowing much more difficult. You know what you have been doing, it can be called fake news and stuff. So, what do you think about this? The development of the way that the policies and the regulations and all this.
Well, it's a good attempt to stifle, but then again, of course, I think it's intimidating to a large part of society because 500,000 fine is huge.
Yes, it is. And 10 years.
In 10 years. But then again, people like me grew up during the ISA, when ISA regime was in place, you know. Political activists, young activists like me then, had to contend with one letter and then you are off indefinitely in prison. My point is this. Any governments in the world can try to stifle, regulate, intimidate, send this negative messages to people, but then eventually there will be people who rise up to challenge such laws. You know, when laws are unfair and laws are meant to stifle, not to liberate, you know, what will happen is there will always be persistent opposition to that laws, and every now and then there will be people who are willing to put their necks on the line, you know, and eventually that law stops from becoming effective. Bad laws, no matter how intimidating and threatening it is, eventually becomes ineffective because people just ignore it. And there will come a tipping point unless the authority decides to fine everyone and put everyone in jail. After a while, you know, I think
you can't have the space to do that.
Yeah, they just can't do it. It's too much.
Okay, so just now you've mentioned that, you know, the income gap and the economy situation of Malaysia, which is deteriorating. Do you think this is the biggest problem in Malaysia?
No, I think the biggest problem in Malaysia is the school.
Our education.
Yeah. I mean, the widening income gap, you know, the fact that the bottom 40 grows bigger is because our education system is struggling to catch up, not just with the competitors, not just with Singapore or with China or with Korea or with Vietnam. It struggled to even catch up with what we need in the country, you know. Even the basic needs of the industries, of the economy. If you go and talk to the young ones, they will say that they got so frustrated because they have a degree, they graduate, but no one wants to employ them. If you go and talk to the employers will say that, you know, we can't employ them, they can't do this, they can't do that, they can't think on their own, you know. They can't do anything without any help. Of course, the truth is somewhere in the middle. But my belief is this: the education system has been confined and constrained too long, that it is struggling to bring out the best out of a child, out of a student. And the approach to the education is very different in this country than compared to perhaps some other countries. I know that people can argue and say the education system, the school system in China is a lot stringent, for example. The school system in Singapore is mean compared to what we have. Yet, if you look at in Scandinavia and some other European countries, I like the idea where you look at every single student, every single child as someone with massive potential. If he can't do the maths, he might be able to draw well. If he can't sing, he might be a good footballer. And I think the European approach to it is more to get the best out whoever whatever they decide to do in their life. So we ought to be spending the first few years of the school telling kids that they can own the world if they want to, but we don't. Here we basically box people into the good ones, the bad apples, the good oranges. These is the engineers, these are the doctors, and so on. So I think it has taken a toll to the society as a whole. So if we can't fix the school, we have much bigger problem in anything, in economy, in politics, socially. So the biggest problem is the school. It has to be fixed.
Well, I guess that's a frustration for a lot of people. We know that there's a problem there, but we don't know who can fix it, and we can just lift it to the hands in the hands of our government. But nothing much has been done. But anyways, maybe there's one of our audience actually asked. This audience, his name is Lee Wei. So I don't know whether they can capture the question. If Pakatan Rakyat, or I think it's if Pakatan Harapan. See, people are still very confused. If Pakatan Harapan took over the federal government, would Pakatan Rakyat abolishes those parliament acts which seem
contradicted
with our constitution, or maybe violating?
Yeah, violating.
So, could you give some examples?
There are, I think, some practices. I can't recall the exact acts, but there are some rules or practices which perhaps is against the spirit of constitution, or is no longer propagating the intention of the constitution. Discriminatory laws, for example, is one example. The constitution was very specific that there is a special position for the Malays.
Yes.
And this special position is recognized legally, and it's mentioned specifically about education and civil service, Yet that has to be done without discriminating other races. A lot of the practices that are discriminatory are not even in laws. It actually is a practice, Local governments make by rules, by laws, and say if you want to expand your house, it has to be like this, it has to be like that. And so even before we go to that point about laws, a lot of changes has to take place when it comes to rules, procedures, SOPs, and this can be done even without changing the law. But at the top of it, there are a few laws that, to me, clearly
needs to be addressed.
And I wouldn't be so quick to say that it's against the constitution, but it is very prone for abuse by the authority, that it will violate the freedom and the personal liberty of a citizen. One such example is SOSMA, a detention without trial on the suspicion of terrorism. I've dealt with one SOSMA case which sometimes is guilty by association, in my opinion, just because one person knows the other person, and without his knowledge, that person happens to be a sympathizer for ISIS. That person happens to have a photo with you or went out to see you, and then you bundle everyone and you put them 8, 9 years, 10 years, and then 48 days without trial detention. So it's very prone for abuse, and that is something that has to be revised. Even if we retain the law, the safeguards against abuse has to be strengthened, so that the power is not so loosely given to the authority. The other one, of course, the Sedition Act has to be repealed.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think the biggest one, the next after that has to be repealed is, of course, is anti-fake news, because in which part of Constitution that says that the public has no right to think for ourselves? Because that's more or less, long and short of it, what fake news, anti-fake news bill is trying to do. It's basically trying to say that government decide what is right and wrong. If what you put on your Facebook or what you talk we think is wrong, therefore you are liable for this and that and that. So nothing in the law actually defines what is right, what is fake, what is not fake. What is prescribed is that government has the power to decide your posting. So that is clearly against many tenets of the Constitution.
Okay.
So at least 2 or 3 on top of my head. But I think what is more important as well is not just the law, is also a lot of practices which were extra legal, so to speak. You know, it's not even written in the law, but it has been accepted as practices over the years.
Okay, since it's rather interesting because you mentioned the section or the article in the Constitution that provides special position for the Malay race, and your take on that, that it should not be discriminatory. To what extent do you think it can be changed, or where it could actually accord more protection, or maybe to be more fair and equal to other races?
Well, there are 2 parts to it, you know. The first one is the letter of the Constitution. It's what is written in the Constitution, you know. The other one is the spirit behind it. Of course, the Article 153 was written against a backdrop of a lot of insecurities, of Malays felt they were displaced in their own lands, you know. I don't think anyone who wrote that or who agreed on that wanted Malays to be dependent on a paragraph of protection in the Constitution. But given the backdrop of insecurity then, of course, that it was put there, and therefore, for as long as that insecurity exists, of course, the issue about Article 153 or removing it or amending it or watering it down or being fairer or extending the same to other races will always become an emotional polemic. So I have always said to my friends, the non-Malay friends, the Chinese, the Indians, the Westerners, and say that, you know, issues like that is not something that you confront head on by way of saying you have to remove it. Sometimes it might still be there, but eventually, even in the next 10 years, I'm not surprised when more and more Malays actually feel they can compete, that there's nothing to fear from Chinese or Indians, or when they realize that they are better off competing actually rather than being under the protection of special privileges like that. While the Constitution may remain there, but I think the practices and the policies that favor or that discriminates the non-Malays across the board actually will become more and more untenable. So
okay, this is quite interesting because I want to ask you, like, how do you think that this insecurity is growing, like it's increasing, or it has been lesser over the years since, you know, when the article was drafted? It was a long time ago. So maybe you can help us to understand the Malay community a little bit, like, you know, how many % of people still feel very insecure and they need this kind of protection to be accorded to them via the Constitution.
I think Dato Sri Najib has helped a lot to lessen the insecurity, not by design though. What happened in the last 10 years, I think, is this: the inequality and the economic hardship, especially among Malays, has made them realize, more and more young ones actually
That they need
realize,
to compete.
Perhaps not straight to that point, straight away, but made them realize is that this so-called Malay protection serves no one. They don't get anything out of it, you know. we live in a country where constitutionally Malays are so-called special, have a special position, but they can't get a job. Their degree sometimes wouldn't guarantee them anything. They struggle. So it makes them think that at the end of the day, a lot of it is politics. It actually does not benefit them that much, you know. Then when that happens, the focus then shift towards governance, towards accountability against corruption. That is when I think people realize that there's a lot of the issues, a lot of the issue is not really about the Chinese versus the Malays versus the Indians or protection. It's more about how the economic cake goes to everyone fairly. And as that happens, more and more I think of the younger Malays will understand that it is better to compete and grow the economic cake, because you will get a bigger pie when the cake is bigger. Of course, comparatively there are a lot more poor Malays compared to Chinese. By a percentage, there are more poorer Indians than Chinese or Malays. You know, I think so long as there is safety net for the poor ones, and by design that means that majority of those are from Malays, without neglecting the fact that the Chinese poor and the Indian poor also have to be helped. And if we manage to do that in one generation, in the next 10 years, I think it will build up so much confidence in the Malays that they can actually compete, and eventually the so-called the need for constitutional protection becomes less and less relevant every day.